Adolf Hitler's path to infamy was paved with the frustrations and bitterness of a troubled youth. His early years were marked by a series of personal and familial challenges that would shape his worldview and fuel his later actions.
Born in Austria in 1889, Hitler experienced a difficult childhood marked by an overbearing father and the loss of several siblings. His father, Alois Hitler, was a strict and authoritarian figure who demanded obedience and showed little affection. This harsh upbringing left young Adolf feeling isolated and unloved. His dreams of becoming an artist were dashed when he was rejected from the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. Twice he applied and twice he was turned away, each rejection a blow to his fragile ego. The Academy's decision not only crushed his aspirations, but also deepened his sense of failure and inadequacy. This rejection fueled a deep sense of resentment and inadequacy within him. He spent his days in Vienna, living in poverty, and his nights brooding over his perceived injustices. The city, with its vibrant cultural life, was a constant reminder of what he could not achieve.
Adrift and disillusioned, Hitler found himself drawn to the simmering anti-Semitism and nationalist fervor that permeated Vienna in the early 20th century. The city's political climate was rife with xenophobia and racial hatred, providing fertile ground for his growing animosity. He embraced these ideologies as an outlet for his anger and frustration, blaming Jews and other marginalized groups for his own personal failures and the perceived decline of German society. This scapegoating provided him with a convenient explanation for his misfortunes and a target for his rage.
These formative years planted the seeds of hatred and prejudice that would later blossom into his monstrous ideology. The bitterness and resentment that festered within him during this period would eventually manifest in his ruthless pursuit of power and his unrelenting persecution of those he deemed inferior. Hitler's early experiences instilled in him a profound belief in his own superiority and a deep-seated resentment towards those he perceived as different or inferior. This toxic combination of arrogance and hatred would become the cornerstone of his political ideology and his justification for the atrocities he would later commit. His inability to cope with rejection and his tendency to scapegoat others for his own shortcomings would become defining characteristics of his leadership style. These traits, coupled with his charismatic oratory skills, allowed him to manipulate and rally others to his cause, spreading his venomous beliefs far and wide. These dangerous traits, combined with his burgeoning anti-Semitism and nationalist zeal, laid the foundation for his transformation from a disgruntled outcast into a ruthless dictator. His rise to power was fueled by the very resentments and prejudices that had taken root in his youth, ultimately leading to one of the darkest chapters in human history. Hitler's rise to power was a chilling testament to the seductive nature of absolute power and the ease with which charisma can mask a deeply disturbed mind. His journey from a failed artist to the Führer of Nazi Germany is a stark reminder of how personal insecurities and societal turmoil can intertwine to create a perfect storm for tyranny. His personal insecurities, far from hindering his ascent, became the driving force behind his insatiable thirst for control and domination. These insecurities were rooted in his early life, marked by rejection and failure, which fueled his desire to prove himself and assert his superiority over others.
He craved adoration and validation, using his position as leader of the Nazi Party to surround himself with sycophants who fueled his growing sense of grandiosity. His ability to manipulate and inspire those around him was unparalleled, and he skillfully used propaganda to craft an image of invincibility and infallibility.
As his power grew, so too did his delusions. He began to see himself not just as a political leader, but as a messianic figure, destined to lead Germany to a new era of greatness. This self-aggrandizing vision was bolstered by his inner circle, who were eager to please and afraid to contradict him. He saw himself as a messianic figure, destined to restore Germany to its former glory. This delusion was not just a personal fantasy, but a central tenet of Nazi ideology, which portrayed Hitler as the savior of the German people, chosen by fate to lead them to a utopian future. His speeches, laced with a potent mix of nationalism, xenophobia, and promises of a utopian future, captivated a nation grappling with economic despair and political instability. He masterfully tapped into the fears and frustrations of the German people, offering them a scapegoat for their problems and a vision of a brighter future under his rule. He offered simple solutions to complex problems, preying on the fears and prejudices of a desperate populace. By blaming Jews, communists, and other marginalized groups for Germany's woes, he diverted attention from the real issues and consolidated his power through division and hatred.
Hitler's leadership style was characterized by an intoxicating blend of charisma, ruthlessness, and a complete disregard for human life. His ability to inspire fervent loyalty and blind obedience was matched only by his willingness to use violence and terror to achieve his goals. He demanded absolute loyalty from his followers, rewarding blind obedience with positions of power and influence. Those who dared to question or oppose him were swiftly eliminated, creating a culture of fear and submission within the Nazi Party.
Dissent was met with swift and brutal repression as Hitler consolidated his grip on all aspects of German society. The Gestapo and SS were instrumental in enforcing his will, using surveillance, intimidation, and violence to crush any opposition. The once vibrant democracy of the Weimar Republic crumbled under the weight of his tyranny, transforming into a totalitarian state where fear and intimidation silenced all opposition. The freedoms and rights that had been hard-won during the Weimar era were systematically dismantled, replaced by a regime that demanded absolute conformity and obedience. Propaganda was the lifeblood of the Nazi regime, a sinister tool used to manipulate public opinion and manufacture consent for its genocidal agenda. It was not just a method of communication, but a weapon of psychological warfare, meticulously crafted to infiltrate every aspect of daily life and reshape the collective consciousness of the German people. Joseph Goebbels, the mastermind behind Nazi propaganda, understood the power of words to shape perceptions and mold beliefs. He was a master orator and a shrewd strategist who knew that the key to controlling a nation lay in controlling its narrative. He recognized that by controlling the flow of information, he could control the minds of the masses. Goebbels' propaganda ministry worked tirelessly to ensure that every piece of news, every film, and every radio broadcast served the interests of the Nazi Party.
Under Goebbels' direction, the Nazi propaganda machine churned out a relentless stream of posters, films, radio broadcasts, and newspaper articles designed to glorify the Nazi Party and demonize its enemies. These materials were not just informative, but emotionally charged, designed to evoke strong feelings of nationalism, fear, and hatred. Jews were portrayed as parasitic vermin, responsible for Germany's economic woes and moral decay. This dehumanization was a crucial step in justifying the atrocities that would follow, as it made it easier for ordinary citizens to accept and even participate in the persecution. Political opponents were branded as traitors and enemies of the state. The propaganda machine worked to create a climate of fear and suspicion, where dissent was not just discouraged but actively punished. The message was clear: conformity meant safety, dissent meant death. This binary choice was hammered home through every medium available, leaving little room for ambiguity or resistance.
The Nazi regime's control over the media was absolute. Newspapers, radio stations, and even the burgeoning film industry were all co-opted to serve the party's aims. Independent journalism was crushed, and only the Nazi-approved narrative was allowed to reach the public. Newspapers and radio stations were either shut down or forced to toe the party line. Any deviation from the official narrative was met with swift and brutal retribution, ensuring that the media landscape was entirely under Nazi control. Artists and intellectuals who refused to conform were silenced or driven into exile. The regime understood that creative and critical thinkers posed a threat to their control, and they took extreme measures to eliminate this threat. Education was transformed into a tool of indoctrination, with children taught to revere Hitler and embrace Nazi ideology from a young age. Schools became breeding grounds for future soldiers and loyalists, where critical thinking was replaced with blind obedience. Through this systematic campaign of manipulation and control, the Nazi regime was able to poison the minds of an entire generation. The impact of this indoctrination was profound, creating a society where loyalty to the Führer was paramount, and any form of dissent was unthinkable. The legacy of this propaganda machine is a stark reminder of the power of media to shape reality and the importance of safeguarding freedom of expression.